This is going to be a quick video about the subjunctive formation. By the end of the video, you should be able to conjugate verbs into the subjunctive mood. I'm going to go quickly through this because, like I said, this is just going to be a brief introduction to what the subjunctive is and how it's formed. So please pause the video and fill in the sheet as you go along, so that way in class you can pay attention to how it's used and why it's used, but now you'll at least know the rules behind its formation. So briefly, the subjunctive is the mood of uncertainty and emotion. Verbs in the subjunctive mood are generally used in a dependent clause introduced by que. We're going to go into more detail about this in class and in a future video. But briefly, what is the subjunctive? The subjunctive is a mood, which means it's an entirely different way about talking about the world around us. The subjunctive is not used to report the world as it is, or as it was, or as it will be. If you want to do these three things, that's the indicative, and that's what you've been using in French for the last 4 or 5 years. Instead, the subjunctive is used to report the world as one would like it to be, as it's seen through the subjective filter of one's emotions, and as viewed in one's opinions. Actions are thus presented not as facts, but as hypotheses. Or actions are presented as events that are influenced by the subjectivity of the person who is speaking. So again, we'll go into more detail about this in the future. In English, we think Beyonce, her song, If I Were a Boy. This is an example of the subjunctive in English, but the subjunctive is not very common in English today. But you may have heard some of these sentences before. So the subjunctive in English, like I mentioned before, it's not used so much in English, and French uses it a lot more than we do. But it's very important that you know this because you will hear it often and you need to know how to use it to communicate well. There are 4 tenses in the subjunctive mood: the present, the past, the imperfect, and the pluperfect subjunctive, but we're only going to be focusing on the present and the past. There is no future tense in the subjunctive. An action in the future is expressed by the present subjunctive. So, how do we form the subjunctive for regular verbs? You take the il form of the verb in the present tense, drop the ent, and add the following endings. Remember, you can pause the video at any point so you can have time to write all of this down. So here is an example of an ER verb, expliquer, an example of an IR verb, réussir. So yes, you need all of those S's for regular IR verbs. And défendre, a regular RE verb. But of course, in French, if you haven't learned yet, you should know that there are a lot of exceptions to the rules. So remember that we've got boot verbs in the present tense. If it's a boot verb in the present tense, it still has that boot change in the subjunctive. So in the subjunctive, the je, tu, il, el, singular and plural are the same, but the nu and the vous are slightly different. Oh, and please note that the tabs got messed up on this one. That que should be with the nu over to the side. Luckily for us, most of the irregular verbs in the present tense can also be formed like any regular verb, where you take the il form, remove the ent, and add the endings that you saw on the previous page. Here are a few examples. And here are a few more verbs that are like this. They are irregular in the present tense, but they are formed regularly in the subjunctive, meaning you take the il plural form, take off the ent, and add the endings. Also, fortunately, there are only a few verbs that are totally irregular. So for these verbs, those stems are the same for all 6 subjects, or more subjects. But you just have to memorize that they're an irregular stem. There are, however, a number of irregular verbs that have 2 stems. One stem for the nu and vu, which usually looks like the infinitive, and then a different stem for the boot. Aller is one of those. Here are some other 2-stem verbs. You notice the je would be what's for the, and the nu is what the stem would be for nu and vu. Again, remember, pause the video whenever you need to. There are 2 verbs that are totally irregular. You just have to memorize them in all forms. No surprise, they're avoir and être. So that's the end of this video. Again, we breeze through it because it's strictly conjugation. I know that you like to know these things, but otherwise, we're going to practice in class, and you'll have another video that's more specific on how it's used and when it's used. Please let me know if you have any questions.